Uh, Hello. So we welcome you all to this book discussion with Harsh Mander. Today we have with us Harsh Mander, who is an author, a columnist, researcher, and a human rights activist who works with street children, homeless people, survivors of mass violence and hunger. He has a PhD from the Free University of Amsterdam and was an employee of the Indian Administrative Services. In 2017, he started the Karwane Mohabbat campaign in solidarity with victims of communal violence. He is one of India's most trusted and courageous social justice and human rights activists. He has received numerous awards, both national and international. He is also the author of several acclaimed books. And today he is here to discuss with us his most recent book, Burning Pyres, Mass Graves, and a State That Failed Its People, India's COVID Tragedy. So I invite him on stage to discuss with us this book. We will also have Shantanav Chakrabarti, who works on quantum computing, Anirban Dasgupta, who works on developmental economics, and Siddiqa Fatima, who is a PhD student here who works on contemporary Urdu literature to facilitate and moderate this discussion.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. So it's nice to see some turnout on a Sunday afternoon. So thanks for coming, and a very warm welcome, Harsh, to Triple IT. It's great to have you here. So as Prerna mentioned, we'll be discussing Harsh's new book. We'll have a conversation around it. We'll try to keep things as informal as possible. So we'll be asking, some questions to Harsh surrounding his book, and then we'll open things up to the audience. So we'll keep a lot of time for audience question and answers. So feel free also to join in. About this book is actually a comprehensive account of the Indian COVID experience. Certainly, one of the gravest challenges that we faced as a people, certainly the gravest health emergency in the past century. And Harsh's book is an extremely well-researched account of that tragedy. It has a lot of facts, well-researched data, but something that we particularly liked about the book, and I can speak here on behalf of the three of us, is that the book also has a lot of personal stories, first-hand accounts through Harsh's and his comrades' work in via Karwa and other volunteers who give us in this book first-hand experiences of the tragedy, and including Harsh's own personal experience in the public ward in a general ward of a public hospital. And what this brings out is how starkly different the COVID experience was for the India's poor and the marginalized, who comprise, after all, the democratic majority. And how different it is from, say, the top 10%, 15% of India's population, which I think most of us belong to. So let me begin, Harsh, by asking you, why did you write this book? Why now? And, we, at least those of us in the top 10, 15% seem to have, moved on with our lives. And the COVID experience is just a distant dream at best. So why now, the timing of the book?
So thank you. Thanks all of you for inviting me and reading what is definitely a very intense narrative. And thank you all for coming on a Sunday afternoon. Why did I write this book? I actually say in my book, I write so that we don't forget. And I'm amazed at how quickly this is, for those of us, including myself, who've not lived through the Great Bengal famine or India's partition riots. It is the biggest calamity that we've seen in our country. And anything between the government figure of 500,000 to scholarly calculations of 5 million people having died. And a great part of those deaths should not have happened, need not have happened. And that they did not die because of the COVID vaccine, they died because of what the state did and did not do. So, so it should have been the central, content of our social discussions, our political discussions. And have you heard, five states are going to elections. There's the general. Nobody's even mentioning this tragedy. And so, so I begin by saying, I believe it's our public duty to remember, to not forget. And I say, I explain first of all, we must remember so that we grieve. Every life that was lost, every one of those 5 million lives that were lost were people with lives, with dreams, with aspirations, with families, with friends. And we can't just, their erasure has not even created a ripple. So I speak about how, firstly, we must remember because every life lost was grievable. And we actually, all of us, you and I, belong to a social class, and which is reflected in the governments that we choose, where clearly some lives are important and need to be protected, and a great number of the lives of the people in this country are expendable lives. They don't matter. So firstly, let us grieve for each of those lives that were lost and need not have been lost. And then I say, I write this so that we can rage. We must rage about why this was done to us in the ways that it was, and we'll talk about some of that. Arundhati Roy, somewhere, she manages to put things very, very, very sharply. She says, COVID-19 was a virus, as we all know. But she said it was something much more. It was an X-ray. It was an X-ray that revealed to us in all its starkness what we have become as a people and what is our government. How do we practice our public life? So looking at that X-ray, we must rage. But then I go on to say, along with the grief and the rage, I also found many reasons to hope. And I talk about ordinary people and the extraordinary acts of kindness and solidarity and courage that people displayed in many parts of the country. And so, with our grief, with our rage, and with our hope, can we use all of these as kinds of bricks to imagine a new future? In fact, the WHO says, we're talking about, it doesn't say if the next pandemic comes, it says when the next pandemic comes is the question. And we seem to have learned so little from the earlier pandemics. There's a Hindi writer, Nirala, who was actually alive during the Spanish flu more than 100 years ago. And in his descriptions, he lost most of his family. He describes bodies floating in the Ganga. And 100 years later, we see bodies floating in the Ganga. And 100 years later, we're going to again see bodies floating in the Ganga. What I write so that we understand where we went wrong. We went wrong in what our governments did during the pandemic, and we'll probably talk about it. But I think we went wrong also because of a whole set of, we built our country in a way that some lives matter and a huge number don't. And unless we confront that, how we ever going to change things for the better? I'll talk really, 1890 something in Bombay, they had the Great Plague. Again, hundreds of lives were lost. And it was a colonial administrator actually who wrote at that time. He said, in order to ensure that this never happens again, we need to ensure every resident of the city two things, and they come completely free. He said, clean air and clean water. And look at the cities we've built. So I write so that in the hope that with our grief, with our rage, with our hope, we learn and imagine and then build a better future where this never happens again. My publisher, when the book was released and there were reviews, etc., but not so many copies have been sold. Maybe you can change that a little bit after this day. But he was trying to, he was reassuring me. He said, Harsh, people won't read your book much today, but 30 years later, this is what they'll read to understand what happened. So I said, okay, I'll wait the 30 years. But I write because we should not allow this to happen again.
Right, and indeed, continuing from that, notion of not forgetting and always remembering, what happened. It's hard to forget what happened during the first wave with the abrupt and draconian lockdown and its ramifications.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden, this was announced with extremely, extremely short notice in a country as unequal as ours, was completely shut down. And then the middle class was in their homes, right, because of the lockdown. And then you saw suddenly in your TV screens millions of migrant workers taking the long and winding road to nowhere. And it's as if the state and the privileged Indian had rendered these people invisible. And suddenly, out of the inactivity of the lockdown, these people were expunged. As the cities, locked its doors, these people were expunged from the cities. Can you elaborate on this, the role of the state and the reaction from the Indian privileged class?
We'll all have, I guess, memories of sitting in front of the television screen and watching the Prime Minister announce the lockdown. Incidentally, people say it happened around the world. India, even China locked down 5% of its population. We locked down 100% with 3.5 hours notice. And with one of the smallest relief packages anywhere in the world. But when he was speaking, he said, stay at home and work from home. I said, he's my Prime Minister. Has he forgotten that 9 out of 10 workers in this country are informal workers? They eat what they earn on a day-to-day basis. What about them? What's going to happen to them? And I work a lot with homeless people. I mean, they'll be starving from tomorrow. Then he said, keep social distance. And social distance is actually an awful term, especially in India, because we've kept social distance for 2,000 years in caste. So let's use some other term. Let's say physical distance. I said, 6 out of 10 Indians live in one room or less. How are they going to keep any kind of distance? He said, wash your hands regularly. I mean, any of you just go outside a slum any morning and see, the scramble when a tanker comes and people spend something between about a quarter of their daily earnings to get 2 pots of water. You're asking them to wash their hands regularly. So what was immediately transparent to me that our government was not concerned about people who didn't have regular jobs, didn't have homes in which they could live with running water and social distance and health insurance and, in fancy hospitals. And the government was working for us. And it wasn't working at all for the large mass of working people. What troubles me about us, you and I, is our absence of outrage. Why wasn't our first reaction collectively? Like, we're not the only people in this country. Do something for all our people. When the migrant sort of exodus started, and an estimated 30 million people walked hundreds of kilometers in the hot sun, being beaten up by the police, sleeping on railway tracks and getting run over. Some of them hid inside, these cement those carrot trucks which are completely airless at 40 degrees, and so on. Why were they there? And who were they? A lot of people said, where did all these people come from? And my answer to them is just look at any day in your life. Who supplies the milk at your door? Who supplies the newspaper at your door? Who comes in and sweeps your floors and takes care of your children and cooks your food, and who drives you to work, and from who do you buy your cheap vegetables? Every hour of our lives is facilitated and highly subsidized by the cheap labor, and we don't even look at them. We don't. Where did they come from? Don't you see your daily life? We don't even look at poor people as people, and we were suddenly surprised. And then if you think a little harder, suppose you were in a place far away from home, and overnight something happened and they said no salary, no wages. And you had no health insurance. And the whole world seemed to have been, come to its knees because of this, strange, terrifying new illness. Where would you want to be? Even if you were going to die, especially if you were going to die, where would you want to be? You would want to be with people you love, who will care about you. Why was it so difficult to understand that when you've done this, people will want to be at their homes? While thinking a lot, and partly why I wrote this book, I forgot to say, was that I heard this and I resolved something that I've learned from Gandhiji is civil disobedience. I will disobey a law or a state that I feel is unjust. And I said, I will be on the streets from tomorrow. And will try to provide food and care. And I thought I'd be alone, and many people came, and sometime I'll talk about how more people gathered, and then people from faraway places. And because we had the Karwan-e-Mohabbat, which was responding to lynching and hate violence across the country, I have, a collective of beautiful people in every corner of the country, and they came in, and everybody started trying to, and we distributed 10 million meals together in the course of those months. So what I was witnessing, I used to come back home and then feel I just have to. So the first half of this book is written really in that red heat of that moment. But just coming back a little to the migrants, I looked at what is the capacity of our railways. The railways carry 23 million people every day, and you halted them. At the time the lockdown was done, even if whether we should have had a lockdown or not, I hope we'll never do something like this again, for reasons that we can discuss. But even if you decided to do that, we had just 500 cases in the entire country. Suppose the government had said, okay, in 1 week we will have a lockdown, the trains will run free, go to where you have to go. How complicated was that? And if they had done it. And one other thing, right away, is that if we are getting our minimum, we are getting our salaries sitting at home. So for you and I, of course, lockdown was stressful. We had times with our loved ones, but perhaps too much time, and it got a little sort of complicated. And there was boredom, and we saw too much of Netflix, and so on. That's what the lockdown was for us. What was it for these other people? And the desperation of, and not only were they not facilitated by the state to reach to their homes, they were being beaten, they were sprayed with disinfectant, like vermin. And they endured all of this, and they died along the way, and people literally starved. I mean, there was this video that I hope we should never forget, of this woman in her 20s somehow trying to reach her home, and she dies of starvation, and her little baby is trying to wake her up. All of that happened. One more thing I wanted to say, and that was, while all of this happened, where was our empathy and solidarity? Us. And I've written this book largely for you and I, to hold up that mirror to that X-ray. In the middle of all of this, government was still ensuring special planes for people who were studying abroad. And then quota became an interesting place, because, as we know, several lakh young people, guys, I don't know how many of you were there, and to prepare for those exams and get tuitions, etc. So there was a crisis. There were 2-3 lakh young people, but young people not from the expendable lives, but from the precious lives. And so the government, of course, then organized decent buses to reach each of those children home, which it should have done. But my dream, and it's just a dream, while it was happening, I said, could there have been one student who stood up and said, I refuse to get onto this bus, because millions of people around my age are being forced to walk hundreds of kilometers in the hot sun to reach their homes, like I need to reach my home. And I demand from my government that the same facilities that have been given to me are given to each of those people. But we did not care. So there is the culpability of the state, but right through it is the culpability of the rich and the middle classes of my country.
So, in your book, you've thoroughly documented the callous indifference meted out to large sections of our population. It seems almost as if the pandemic was used as an opportunity to further marginalize the marginalized. And this is a harsh opinion, but still, it appeared almost as if the state deliberately tried to do away with these sections of the society, in spite of the fact that they contribute a large majority of the democratic public. There's this quote that you've used. Okay, so Debashish Chakrabarti's metaphorical use of Dante's Inferno to describe the situation, as if there's a metaphorical sign put out by the Indian government to describe India at the time. Abandon all hope, ye who enter here. So, what do you think this says about the class character of the Indian state?
No, I think the X-ray of the pandemic, if you're willing to see it, indicates who the state works for and who it doesn't feel responsible to at all, and who it is actively hostile to. The pandemic first was very useful to crush the nationwide anti-CA protests. Please remember that they were happening at that time with Shaheen Bagh, and all of those were shut down. That was only the beginning. One of the most extraordinary things, I mean, there are so many extraordinary things that happened within the lockdown, and I'm amazed at the power of the state to convince billion plus Indians that this virus was actually being spread as a conspiracy by India's Muslims. The virus suddenly turned Muslim, and it didn't take long. It took within a week. The whole country was locked down, and in a week, rationally speaking, what had happened? There were about 900 people who had taken permission and called the Tablighi Jamaat. It's an orthodox Islamic sort of movement which talks about going back to the fundamentals of the Quran, and people gather and read the Quran together. So they had their gathering, they had permission to have the gathering, and it was in Nizamuddin in Delhi. And suddenly it was turned around, and of course with the media so willing to go along, it suddenly became that this whole country was being infected because those 900 people had gathered in one one building in Nizamuddin. And they kept talking about the tablighi and I don't know, various terms, and every day television was blaring this. I'm just amazed at the capacity. The country was locked down, and within a week you are able to propagate an idea which diverted all attention from what the state should have done to a targeted community against which in many clear ways the state is almost at war with. And that's a totally different story. Why India's Muslims? Because the foundational idea of our country when we became free was that this was a country where it would not matter whether you worship Bhagwan or Allah or none of these. It wouldn't matter what your caste, your gender, your class. You'd be an equal citizen in every way. That's the foundational idea of India. And the people in power today belong to an ideology which was passionately, has been and remains passionately opposed to this foundational idea of equal citizenship. And therefore the war on that constitutional sort of idea of India is centered most of all on India's Muslims. So it served a purpose, but the success in suddenly convincing people across the country, and how educated people, how we are so comfortable with being drawn into this prejudice reflects on us as well again. Like in the second wave, they had something like the Kumbh Mela. In fact, it was the largest gathering anywhere in the world but nobody talks about that. There was a gathering of Sikhs in Andhra Pradesh, in Hazur Sahib. Nobody talks about that. I mean, there are gatherings of people everywhere for everything. But it just became this. And a lot of my colleagues who started providing relief, as I was describing, are of Muslim identity. And so many of them reported that even you take food to a hungry, people starving, and they find out your name and they say, you are responsible, we won't even take this food from you. And this whole, I'm just amazed again at the story. What was propagated is that Muslims are deliberately putting their saliva on vegetables and fruits with the aim that we, the real Indians, will buy those vegetables and get infected. Now, to believe, firstly, sort of something, sort of a dystopian mythology of this kind, it became popular across. And Thuk Jihad is one of the things that are continuing even till today. People are saying, don't allow Muslim vegetables, sellers, and so on. And there are many parts of India now you have to put a saffron flag where you are selling your vegetables, etc. Now, this happened when the government should have been attending to helping us in the most humane way go through the pandemic. And I think I lost track a little bit to something I was wanting to say, which I'll just add. This was the wage question. I mean, if we had to go in for a lockdown, and that is highly debatable, but assume that it was the right decision, the very least that the government should have done was to ensure that, like us in the formal sector, I'm sure everybody got their salaries in their bank accounts every month. The unorganized workers should have also got it. So you pay the equivalent of minimum wages through the period of the lockdown. If they had done that, the migrant crisis wouldn't have happened. The economy would not have collapsed. Most of the distress could have been avoided. I went to the Supreme Court with a petition saying, please do this. I said free distribution of PDS rations, universal, and payment of minimum wages right through. And then I wrote a series of op-eds along with two leading economists, Prabhat Patnaik and Jayati Ghosh, where they argued as economists, they said to do so would have cost 3% of the GDP. And which was something that we could, and in fact they said the calculation that because you're giving it out, because that money will come back into the economy and multiplier effects, etc., it wouldn't have even cost us 3% of the GDP. And the suffering that could have been prevented, and finally the collapse of our economy was actually much greater than 3%. But we didn't do that. The government didn't do it. In the Supreme Court, it actually went and said, there is no hunger in the country. There is no, there's no distress migration. They said all kinds of stuff in our petition, formally, on affidavit. And we let that suffering happen. And why so many people, because I was on the streets, if I had one line over and over again, it was Modi ji ko samjhaya. I mean, everything is now, everyone was talking to us to tell Modi ji something. He said, Modi ji ko samjhaiye, कोविड से तो हम बाद में मरेंगे, पहले तो हम भूख से मरेंगे. And I'll just say one more thing to be a little provocative. Compare with, the rest of the world did many sort of remarkable things to deal with the pandemic. Okay, slightly less provocative, but just to illustrate, Boris Johnson is not a great prime minister by any stretch, especially not pro-poor. But because I work with homeless people, I was sort of seeing what is happening to them. So I called up friends in the UK who work with homeless people. I said, what's happening with homeless people there? And they said, they're all okay because they've been all checked into into hotels. 7-star hotels downwards, every hotel was booked by the state to house all homeless people. The hotels industry was saved, the workers there were saved, homeless people had, had a place of safety. Like this happened under a Tory government in the UK. But the provocative part is Pakistan. Imran Khan, playboy, with no claims of, being, selling tea at a railway station, which actually didn't exist at the time that it was supposed to be sold. Sorry, I couldn't avoid that aside. But assuming that, that our Prime Minister sold tea and came up from poverty, Imran Khan has no such claim. But when he was advised to go in for a lockdown like India, he clearly said, how can I have a lockdown in India, in Pakistan, where we have so many poor people? How will they eat tomorrow? So he refused to have a lockdown. And it's interesting that they did hardly anything. But actually the impact on both COVID and the economy was actually much better than India. Because the leadership there showed some elementary public compassion, which we did not display, and you and I did not demand from our government.
What do you have to say about the role of the Supreme Court at this time? Was it heeding to the interventions and advice of the civil society and the activists? Were there any positive recommendations, and were they heard by the government?
The Supreme Court, like many of our institutions, failed us in this time. And this is being recorded, and contempt is welcome. Because it was my, along with 2 other people, it was our petition in front of the Supreme Court. The government would say everybody is being served food. There's no problem of food. And they actually had data just from Kerala and I think one or other state to show the numbers. And it was very easy to see it. But the Supreme Court said, no, the government is saying everybody is getting food, so we don't have to do anything. And then when we said give minimum wages, this is what the judges said. They said, if they're getting food, why should they need money? And what I really wanted to say is, I don't call them lordships, whatever, dear respected judges. If that is the thing, then I guarantee I will give you sort of 5-star food served to you morning, evening and night in your home. You should then not get your salary. Why do you imagine poor people, I don't know, they like, throw some food at them and that's all they need. So our courts did not rise up to the demands that this greatest humanitarian crisis of our lifetimes demanded from them.
Um, I had wanted to ask you about the communalization of the virus, and you have already talked about it. But it didn't stop. I mean, of course, the middle class, I mean, the communal identity is the sort of lowest hanging fruit. But then come poor people in general,
Yeah.
right? So people who come to work in our homes, they have to come, they have to wash their hands, they have to go around doing whatever they do, wearing 2 masks, 3, if we want them to. But many of us, I mean, and I'm giving you examples almost, thankfully not in my household, but very close to us, where I've seen the person sweeping the floor with 2 masks on, while the householders
As
are
no
clearly, yeah. I mean, apart from the fact that there's no science to it, and I mean, but the fact is that whatever extra precaution needs to come from their side. Uh, do you think there is something? I mean, do you actually see this feeling of considering everybody else dispensable, having really gone through some sort of a discontinuous jump during this crisis?
No, Anpan, absolutely. I mean, I spoke to domestic workers once uh, we started opening up again. And they were saying that we fought so hard to, we are treated completely as, untouchables within the home. And we've taken a long time to get a little bit of dignified sort of entry. And they said all of that got completely lost because we used this moment to, it played into our attitude to the poor, which is one of pollution and purity and so on. And then this completely irrational idea that we were in danger because of the poor. This virus actually came largely club class and, through the flights from people who could afford them. It was not brought or spread by the poor. And even so, we didn't change our mind, change our attitudes. There's a story I tell here, and it's a very shaming story. Uh, uh, defense colony story, yes. Defense colony is elite, a little enclave in central Delhi. A family there faced a lot of tragedy. This was right at the beginning, where the grandfather, the father, the grandmother, all of them were infected. They fought the virus. And the grandfather sadly passed away. The family was very distressed. And what they did was they filed a complaint in the police station that their security guard, who was a Muslim, must have gone to the Tablighi Jamaat gathering, and he brought the virus to us, and he is the cause of the death of our grandfather. Police accepted the complaint rapidly and made a lot of noise about this and rapidly arrested that man. He kept saying, I didn't go to the Tablighi Jamaat. Anyway, as it turned out, I mean, nobody asked the family, why were you getting the security guard into your home? Because we in the middle class can't manage without help. So they were the ones who were actually breaking the law, but nobody raised that question. Finally, they tested the security guard and he was clean of the infection. The story that actually emerged was that their grandson studied in some US university and had flown back. And he had carried the infection. And they were then giving that infection to the security guard. But we don't understand. We can't. Nobody apologized to that poor security guard for his arrest and all of this stigmatization. the story of that particular family didn't end. A few weeks later, like, they had to have a domestic helper. So they got a young woman, about 18, from Jharkhand. But then they said, we must get her tested. So tests took some time. 2 weeks, 2 days later, at 10 o'clock at night, the test came and said that she was COVID positive. So what do? They immediately turn her onto the streets. Now this is a young girl, the city is completely locked down. She's a village girl who's come from Jharkhand, and it's in the middle of the night. You could have given her a corner to sleep and done something. They turned her out at that time, and she was wailing away and wailing away. And some people finally came to her help. But this story, it's the story of one family, but you'll find echoes all around us.
And we were saying that there is hope. I mean, I struggle often to find hope, but one still has to keep at it. One thing I wanted to also bring up, I mean, you have talked about the poultry welfare payments which were made and how they compare not favorably at all, not only with developed countries, but with many developing countries as well. And that got me thinking about our health care system itself. And I was just looking at my, books the other day, and I discovered an old report, not so old, that's the point, from 2012 or 2011, of a committee which looked at universal health care.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, after this huge crisis,
I headed another committee which was looking at universal health care for the urban poor. And yes, we had thought through the ideas, but...
Yeah. So this was 2011, 10, 11, even at that time. And so I just wanted to get your thoughts on where we are. I mean, we know we are nowhere near, but is that even in the discourse anymore, especially after this major crisis?
See, the two, and as I said, millions died in our country because of what the state did and didn't do. But not just at that time. It is earlier governments which have cumulatively brought us to a situation. And the two most critical accumulated failures, one was in public health, one was in labor rights, and I'll talk briefly about both. We have one of the most privatized healthcare systems in the world. The Indian government spends a little over 1% of the GDP on healthcare. Countries have 5, 10%. And out-of-pocket expenditure is about 2% of GDP. So people are just spending out of their pockets much more than the state is spending on healthcare. Health personnel, a large proportion of doctors who are trained, many on taxpayers' money, many on their parents' wealth. After they are trained, their first aspiration is to go off to the US or to Europe. In fact, I have a very dear friend, Dr. Shah Alam, who is a professor in All India Institute. And one day he was telling me, he's also a writer, so he said that my problem is that even in the first year, only the bodies of my students are in the class. Their souls have already migrated to the US. Yeah? Okay. Now, given that, out of the doctors who are left with us in India, 8 out of 10 work for the private sector, substantially for corporate hospitals. 8 out of 10. Just two out of 10 work for public health systems. And the small budget that we are spending, a great part of it is on super speciality places like All India Institute, and on premium for private health insurance. So actually state provisioning of health at primary and secondary levels is virtually completely starved. There was no way that the state, when Prime Minister would announce that we are adding 1 lakh beds or 2 lakh beds, it was actually, I can use a polite word, it was a misrepresentation of facts. It was alternative facts, or whatever you'd like to call it. Because what they were doing was they were actually closing down all sorts of departments and redeploying them, because that was all they had. And you had this really dramatic sort of image again, the cancer hospital for patients in Mumbai were made to lie down under an overbridge because those beds had to be vacated for COVID. The only way we could have handled it in the immediate was to nationalize. For the period of the COVID, we should have nationalized. If 8 out of 10 doctors are in the private health system, how are we going to cope unless they become public servants and their beds become public hospital beds? And there are countries that did that. But Spain did, for instance. But we did not do it. We chose not to do it. So it was an impossibility. There was no way that we could have, reached healthcare because of something that had happened through cumulatively through previous governments, especially after the neoliberal reforms. I, am much older than you. In my childhood, my father was an IAS officer. I don't recall ever going to a private hospital. We used to also go to government dispensaries and wait for our turn outside. All of that was destroyed with neoliberalism, and instead of being built up. So that's one reality. Have we learned anything from it? I mean, I thought the one big lesson, would have to be now, at last we've learned and we'll do something about our public health. And the next budget, I waited for it, and the finance minister actually said this is going to, she started off by saying this is going to be a health budget. Wow, let's see. And then when we looked at the figures, it was actually somewhat lower than in the previous year, the allocations. The other part is labor. And in labor, of course, what is happening to our workers and why we have such high levels of informality is because we need this large army of cheap, insecure labor so that you can then pay them the very minimum, owe them no social security, no housing, no care, etc. I thought the second thing we would do is to say, now let us at last go in for some degree of labor protections. But actually what happened, government after government, state governments this comes under, including non-BJP governments, actually after the pandemic reduced even the small degree of protections that existed.
Let's open it up for questions.
Okay, since I have mic, I will go first.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay. I am Siddharth, faculty here. So, I kind of closely look into the health policies and also kind of did some work in the policy matter and all during pandemic. So I think there is an elephant in the room, which is public health. So we discuss politics we discuss about economy, we discuss about development and all this, but we ignore that everything is related with public health. Somehow that doesn't feature, even like when the journalists who were working in the field that time. So health is considered to be soft area, and that's why you will have more female journalists, like, or say, I mean, that is how the things, unfortunately, the things are, rather than.
Female journalists are much stronger.
Yes, that I agree. Like, I'm not saying that. My point is like just
I-
that the how it is. Yeah. So
stereotype,
yeah. So the public health somehow in the society and all, like even now when we are discussing, it seems like COVID is in the past. Now things are better or somewhat like that. But the public health infrastructure in India and also the policy wise is way too bad. The COVID, what COVID, I mean, as you said about the X-ray, so that is what COVID showed us, that it was public sector government hospital that helped people, and all the private were like kind of lynching people of their money. And
the
even
state was protecting their attitude. I mean, Poonawala actually said this. He said the pandemic is a time to make super profits.
yeah, exactly.
And the state facilitated and defended their right to make super profits.
Yeah, exactly. And same with the co-vaccine, like which was given to Biotech, not like to the public sector PSUs. PSUs for vaccines are already down. And somehow I feel that we are still not discussing public health as we should be. And when we say this, like there is this kind of demarcation that, okay, like the top 10% are fine, it is other percent which are not fine. Unfortunately, that is not the case. Like many in the this top 10% became the like went to the 90% because like let's say there were deaths, right? It didn't look after rich poor. Of course, the marginalized section they suffered a lot, but it was also them. Like let's say if the breadwinners they died. Now what are they doing? Like many students didn't even write the exam, like this engineering entrance, and also their future is at stake like already. Unemployment is at rise. Many people lost the job because they couldn't sustain it. Like even many IT and all, like it was work from home, but they had to lose jobs. Some people were doing multiple times. And then let us not even go to the what the gender like atrocities it played. Like the most of the job that were lost were of women and all these things. Now, since the Palestine and Israel issue is going on, so it brings to the question that who somehow became toothless in the sense that the vaccine, like, so some of the vaccines like by Pfizer, Biotech, they were tested in South Africa, but they were reluctant in sending like all these rich countries. I mean, there were all the protocols that were made that whenever vaccines will be made first, we'll be sharing like in this basis and all. Even though just for the, I mean, the cost was of course way too high, but they didn't share these vaccines with the other nations. So somehow, so there was of like I agree wholeheartedly with you whatever you said about our Prime Minister and Supreme Court. I can add like further there because there are many other things I think that we can't take up for the discussion. But somehow even the state governments were complicit to it, be it like non-BJP or non-BJP. Like Kerala government, they had this social program when during the lockdown they were like having food package or something, even like medicines and all, they were sending it to the community, like to the house. And same thing happened in like Dharavai, like in Mumbai. It was very well handled. But the lot of misinformation regarding like let's say the medicines, like right now when you said about the health budget, most of this health budget was also is going in the Ayush ministry, which is useless. But somehow again we don't talk about it. Then the vaccines, like they were given, like everyone were rushing by paying. But vaccine, it is like public good. It should never have been like charged for. And again, these things were not discussed. Like how, then there was a lot of misinformation. Like let's say the mask, it did help. I mean, in US, since people didn't obey, so we know how it was. But, no, yeah, so what I'm saying is somehow the public health, like right now, like the discussion when it was.
Should have. No, I agree with you. Firstly, everything that you have said is, I could have been saying it because it's a summary of a lot of what I discuss in the book, especially in the second half, about hospital beds, vaccines, oxygen, and policies. I totally agree with you. I totally agree that that public health is a deeply political question and a critical one for survival. And we are not doing it because the middle class has found we have escaped, we've created a stratosphere and we've escaped. There's bad law and order, so we go into gated colonies and we have our own. There's bad air, so then we purify our own air. There is terrible schools, so we have all these private schools. The hospitals don't work at all, so we have access to these very expensive hospitals, which actually look like five-star hotels with darbans opening the door and all of that. So we have our escape, and in the same way, so because I totally agree. Amartya Sen has said one interesting thing. he he said that India and China are sort of comparably unequal, but the penalty of inequality is much higher in India than in China, because he said if I belong to the bottom 10% in China, I still have, when my child falls sick, I know I can go to a reasonable public hospital. My child will have some decent level of schooling. We don't have that here. And the problem, I think, is in the end, our cultural comfort with inequality. We don't have a sense of solidarity and outrage. And that's been my sort of lifelong preoccupation. Why don't we care more? And yes, so I agree with every single word that you said, and that is also the central preoccupation of my book.
Can you use a mic maybe, and keep it as
Yeah.
brief as possible?
Yes, so I mean, even the privileged class, right? When there was TB, I mean, TB is predominant in India. She died because the hospitals and all, they were not taking her, and it was like,
So I agree with you again, and I resonate with both your concern, etc. You know, COVID was one obvious time where there was no solo escape path. Either we were all in danger or we were all safe. And despite that, rich countries didn't understand it. So they stocked 4 or 5 times the kind of levels of vaccine that they required. Whereas, and there were countries in Africa which didn't even have 1%, 5% coverage. But then the mutations kept happening because we were all safe together. Likewise, within our country, we were, concerned about ourselves and our own safety and excluding the poor in multiple ways. I mean, just to give it, you're right about all people started dying of all other ailments, which is why the death figure. I mean, we're seeing the additional burden of death. Now, you're saying it's not due to COVID because it was not recorded as COVID. So government has kept the figures down. But it was because of, a lot of it was, anyway, no one had access to treatment in many parts. But it was also because of the government's strategy towards COVID, that led to those deaths, which is where the 5 million figure comes from. No, so we haven't learned the fact that we are all safe together. And the one visit to to a public hospital, I described it somewhat reluctantly in my book, is what happened with me. And this wasn't supposed to be a book about me, and I realized that even at the worst, I'm still privileged and protected. But I was watching as every chief minister, union minister, etc., would fall ill, and they'd all check themselves into expensive private hospitals. And like the health minister of Delhi, he went and checked himself into Medanta. And when journalists asked him, he said, my wife was saying that, if you'd gone into a government hospital, you wouldn't have survived. So I had to go. So I had made a sort of simple sort of promise to myself that if I fall sick in COVID, and since I was on the streets, I would, but I won't go to a private hospital. And then it happened. And then I said, no, it'll be a cop-out. I mean, if I just ring up somebody and I ask for a private room in in the government hospital will still be a cop-out. So I'll go into the public ward of the public hospital. And I cannot tell you how horrific it was. I mean, people had told me stories, but it was as close to hell as you can imagine, and I won't take time to describe it, and I almost died. But that's what we are content with giving to our, and this is a public hospital in the premier hospital in the national capital.
The one thing that I kept thinking about right from the beginning when I was listening to you was the middle class didn't do anything. We're not outraged enough. Are we placing our hope in the wrong place? When has middle class, particularly in the Indian subcontinent, when has it truly been up to the task of making their outrage matter?
That's a very thoughtful question. My only, I've spent a lot of my life trying to make the state more just and caring through changes in laws and policies, and it's been in many different capacities. But I realized that, you might pass a right to food law, or you might pass a law against domestic violence, or the constitution banned untouchability. But it continues. So I mean, in one of my books called Looking Away, Inequality, Prejudice and Indifference in New India, what I argue is that whereas we must strive for a just and equal state, a just and equal state can only exist in a just and equal and caring society. And until we at least bring ourselves to a point, and I compare India's middle class actually with people around the world, and there's great inequalities elsewhere as well. But I find us perhaps the most uncaring people in the world. I mean, our capacity to see intense suffering around us and just turning our faces away. And it has a lot to do with our moral frame of caste, and it's legitimized the British idea of class, the neoliberal idea that greed is good. And we've all absorbed this. But we will not get a government which feels responsible to the poor until people of privilege in this country also feel responsible to the poor. It's a tough one, and I'm addressing the middle class because I know that if they don't change, we will continue to have governments that don't care.
I mean, you ended on a note which actually leads to the question I've been thinking about. We'll have governments which don't care, and one of the things that democracy does, and what you had mentioned, Amartya Sen, I mean, he was talking about there are no famines in India because we have a democracy. But there were corpses in the Ganges, and then the Gangaputras went and re-elected the very people who got the corpses in the Ganges. So something's failed in our democracy too. So it's not just about COVID. And how do we sort that out?
It's a profound question. There was an article in Time magazine, I think it was a cover story, where this journalist had actually followed one migrant worker through all the travels. It was very beautifully written. And he describes how much suffering this person went through. In the end, he asks him, now, agle election, who are you going to vote for? And he says, of course, Modi ji. And then it ends with an interview with me, because he had come to me and said, how do you explain this? And it's not easy to explain. But I said that, there is a certain drug that is being injected into the veins of society. It's a very potent drug. And that drug is hate. And once we are intoxicated with hate, everything is acceptable. Hunger is acceptable, bodies floating in the Ganga acceptable. Everything is acceptable because I am intoxicated with my hate. And it's not unique to India, though, although it's being done most powerfully in India. We're seeing leaders from Trump to Bolsonaro to so many others. Italy now has a neo-fascist government. France's biggest opposition party is purely racist. They're all saying the problem is not with wealth, with inequality, with our policies. The problem is that minority, those people who are coming over from Mexico, those people, desperate people who are coming, the Rohingya on boats across the ocean. They are the problem. And here we are being told that Muslims are our problem. And we are somehow, they're succeeding, and we have to fight back and say no. The problem is with economic policies that benefit the poor. When we talk about universal healthcare, for instance, one of the questions that you haven't raised, but is legitimate to raise, is where the money comes from. And that's exactly what actually Nirmala Sitharaman said when there was a criticism about the budget after. She said, "You're telling me I should expand the budget on healthcare. Tell me where I should take away the money from." And my answer is, don't take away the money from anywhere else. Just tax the rich, the super rich. India's tax to GDP ratio is again among the lowest in the world. It's about 14%. Even the US has something close to 24%. And it has been calculated that if we provide healthcare to all and decent education to all, pensions to the aged, it would cost about 10% of the GDP. Where is that money going to come from? Just a 1.5% tax on dollar billionaires in the world. And incidentally, the pandemic, one of the extraordinary things is that while most of us became poorer and the poor became desperately poor, the wealth we added 39% more to dollar billionaires in the world during the pandemic. And Mr. Adani, I'm sure you've heard of him, Mr. Adani's wealth increased 10 times during the pandemic. And he became the second richest man in the world. And how much that wealth is, a friend, an economist, Jodres calculated. So it's a sort of fun factoid kind of thing. He says if 100 people work at statutory minimum wages, how long would they take to collect the wealth that Mr. Adani accumulated during the lockdown? Take a guess. He's saying 10,000 years, 100 people working 10,000 years. Much higher. 1 million years. We have to understand. I believe that when human history is written, this is going to be regarded as one of the most cruel periods in human history. Because we have the resources so many times over to ensure that this suffering doesn't happen. And we're not doing it because we are willingly being diverted, and the rise of right-wing, what people call right-wing populist leaders, authoritarian leaders elected, I think is resulting from the fact that India's, neoliberal reforms have not created a model which ensures a decent future, decent work, opportunities to the large mass of young people. So either you address that, or then you are convinced that, it was this, like the evil Muslims brought in COVID and putting saliva onto vegetables so that all of us get sick. Now, if you're willing to buy that, or that, good-looking Muslim men are being selected in madrasas and trained to attract Hindu girls who of course have nothing in their heads and who then get attracted, and they get attracted so that they can convert them to Islam and produce Muslim babies. Now, if you and I sadly are being persuaded, and now we have chief ministers talking about love jihad, then something's gone wrong, and the more educated the better. Here in Hyderabad, different topic, but I'm just trying to. There was a medical student, as it happens, a Muslim, very handsome young man, and he said he was sitting in class, and suddenly his teacher said, "Oh, love jihad." So he said, "Sorry, ma'am, my name is not Love Jihad. It's so and so." She said, "No, but boys like you are this thing." And the class laughed, and then his nickname became Love Jihad. So I'm saying that we are being, the poison and fear and hate that is sweeping our land and many countries in the world. Germany now had 13%, and they've done really a lot to fight their fascist history. 13% of people voted for a neo-Nazi party. Their states within, and the Communist Party got 4.5% of the vote share. And there's states in East Germany where they've got now 38, 39% of the vote share. So something is happening across the world, which is where we have to find the answer about why you will still vote, after you've suffered so much. UP was like the site where the bodies floated, and UP resoundingly, just a short while after the second wave, actually elected back the same government. Yeah.
There's a mic. Okay.
So hello.
Okay, sure.
Yeah. So I think protesting or showing outrage, it also greatly, depends on the state apparatus that opposes you. And I think that can really stoke fear amongst people. So we stopped CA protests for sure. But in the US at the same time, post George Floyd, we saw that during the pandemic they were protesting, and obviously we can argue about whether that did anything to strengthen the progressive movements there, but yeah, it did have an impact. And we also spoke about how there is a lack of class solidarity that is greatly driven by caste and religion. And I do agree that middle class needs to be challenged, but as a young development sector worker, and the development sector is also being choked by the government. Where do we start? As students, where do we start? I know no one has the answers. It's a very complicated question. But yeah, this large mindset which we have adopted and now passing on to other students, where we just take care of our own, and our own is a very shrinking. So yeah, how do you think we can challenge that?
That's a beautiful, very important question, and certainly the most difficult question to answer, I'm sure, this afternoon. But it's something I think about a lot. I'm convinced, actually, that part of our resistance has to be in radical new imaginations for our futures. How should we live with people who are different from us? Who worship differently, who dress differently, who eat differently, who speak a different language? Should I be fearful? Should I be resentful? Should I be hateful, as we are being encouraged and taught? Or should I be welcoming? India is actually such a beautiful country, and the state you live in, Hyderabad, and it's because we've actually got so much from so many parts of the world, and we've made it our own. So that's one part. How do we live with people? Are we going to be encouraged more and more to be frightened and hateful to minorities of various kinds? In Nazi Germany has to be a reminder to us that democracy is never just about the will of the majority, because the will of the majority can then become majoritarianism, which can ultimately become fascism. And therefore, democracy is at least equally importantly the defense of every minority. And there India was offering something that was different. In France, secularism would mean to discourage this young woman from coming into this room with a hijab. In India, our understanding of secularism was to defend her right to wear the hijab. And so it's a very different notion. So that's one part of the radical reimagination. But in terms of the economic model, I think there's too little that we have been thinking. Noam Chomsky is somebody who, one of our wisest people in, among public intellectuals in many parts of the world. He said, social protection is ultimately the idea that we should take care of each other. Just think about it. The idea that we should take care of each other. Can that become the starting point for our reimagination of our social contract? That we should take care of each other. That it should trouble me that there's a hungry child sleeping outside unprotected. It should trouble me. It doesn't, and that's the problem. That we should, so I can go on. I mean, the universal social rights, how do we do this? How do we imagine? But I think we waited too long, and unless we participate in a massive public debate of, I mean, largely, most of you are young people. Most of you won't be married. You'll have children one day. They'll grow old. What kind of world do you want to give to them? The time is now decisive for you to decide it. Because the world that we are moving towards is one full of hate. Firstly, with comfort with inequality, and with fear and hate of people who are different from us. Are you happy with giving that world to your children? And if you're not, what are you doing about it?
I have a question. So this government has very effectively used the media to sow hate and division in our country. So obviously we are seeing that more and more media houses are being acquired by people who are affiliated with BJP and other right-wing politics. So, I mean, if media plays is playing such a big role, how do we change that aspect of like this?
It's tough. Again, behind it is the corporate takeover of the media. And it's interesting that whether you're looking at social media, also you look at Facebook, you look at why are they not, the kind of poison that is being spread all over, now in Israel, Palestine, for instance. In every stage, hate and prejudice is fostered. And it's fostered because people are seeing profit in it. And in India, the decline of the media is pretty dramatic. Because in 2002, I was still in the IAS. The Gujarat massacre happened. And I was appalled by what cruelty had happened in the name of religion and hate, and that the state, it was basically enabled by the state. And I chose then to leave the civil service and say that I will not be part of this government any longer. I started working. It was a very difficult time, but I look back now, the media was entirely on my side. The Supreme Court was on my side. The National Human Rights Commission was on my side. It was still a very difficult battle. Today, no one's on your side. So I'm still, it's now, if you do a Google search on me, people say I've done a Google search on you, sort of, I half smile and half sort of grimace, because there's one side which is all right, and possibly even somewhat extra adulatory, but the other side is so full of hate. And what is the hate directed? I have now a huge range of cases. I could spend this life and the next in prison for what I'm charged against. And what is my crime really is that I talk about love. And all I'm saying is let us live together with respect, with love. Let us care about each other. Let us build a country, a society where we take care of each other. Is that such a dangerous idea? In fact, Noam Chomsky actually says the idea that we should take care of each other is today seen as an extremely dangerous and subversive idea. And I'm described actually as a very dangerous man. I don't know how they allowed me to walk into your institution with these dangerous ideas that we must take care of each other.
Yeah. My name is Raman, and I have 3 but short questions. So one is that, my experience says that in India, the COVID experience was, more than a health tragedy, it was an economic opportunity. Okay, when you look at the state as well as look at the corporates. Okay, so what is your take on that? Second question is, I see that there's a lot of blame is being given on the middle class. I can understand middle class is not responding to its duty as far as the politics is concerned. But I think if you look at the COVID experience, imagine the help which was provided by the middle class. If you remove that, what could have been the situation? Okay, so if they would not have come forward, I'm sure the situation would have been much worse. Okay, third question is that when you look at the these people, the migrant workers, these workers who were the most affected person, when you look at today and you talk to them, what is the narrative? That it is because of Modi they have been saved. So the people who have gone through the first-hand experience, they are the people who are actually becoming party to that whole narrative. And I think that narrative is continuously helping them winning. So, and the third question is, maybe, I don't know if you have written this book from the activist or human rights activist kind of, or social activist, but since you have been the IS officer, retired, now if you look at the administrative hat, so what could have been the changes you would have brought in terms of handling this COVID experience?
So that's a lot of questions, very good questions. Yes, it was a health emergency, but the loss of life was largely because of how it was handled. It also was clearly an economic opportunity. When I say that we had a 39% rise in dollar billionaires, and significantly a lot of them were in the health sector during this period of time. And if the wealth of Mr. Adani increased 10 times during the lockdown, then something was happening which was benefiting big corporate houses. The government's policies, I've talked about at great length, vaccination, for instance. We were the biggest producers of vaccination. And if we were not looking at private profit, we could have gone for compulsory licensing. We had public sector units. We had, everybody should have been producing vaccines well in time, and we could have supplied our people and, in fact, the poor countries of Africa and others, which we chose not to do because we were defending private profit of a small number. Coming quickly to your last question, and then I'll go back. The idea that Modi is the great benefactor despite all of this. Something has happened to our democracy. We have been transformed, and Neera Chandok, a political scientist, actually puts it very well. We've been transformed willingly from citizens to subjects. मतलब प्रजा बन गए हैं, और दयालु जो राजा है वो कुछ भी हमें दें तो प्रजा को we have to be grateful for what we've got. It was embarrassing to travel outside the country with that vaccine certificate, because people would look at you and say, that guy doesn't look like you. You say, no, it's not me, it's my prime minister. So then they'd laugh, because there's nowhere in the world where this was done. We got the second wave because we lost that whole vaccine. The only way we could protect ourselves if enough of us had antibodies. Uh, Whatever the reservations about vaccines, that was the only way. The other way of actually, if we didn't go for vaccination, was a Malthusian sort of option. Let everybody get sick and everybody who has to die dies, and then the rest of us will have. So short of that, we could have a vaccination. We didn't do it. It led to all the suffering of the second wave. And then suddenly, when we finally had to do it, for 2 weeks we saw nothing happen. And then it was extraordinary. If you recall, every government building, every street corner, every place had "Thank you, Modi, for giving us vaccines." Why should anyone thank him in any case? We had polio vaccines, we had smallpox vaccines, we have the whole HIV/AIDS treatment. All of it is done by the state because that's the state's duty. I was in Germany, I had free vaccines, and there was no question. I wasn't even a citizen. So, so this whole idea of how we have transformed ourselves from right-holding citizens to people, the food, the free food that is the food that was being distributed. It's ironical that two provisions with which I was closely associated, one was the NREGA and one was the National Food Security Act. If there's anything that actually saved us, saved millions from a near famine situation, was these two programs, because there was a PDS system, there was an NREGA which gave people this backlog. You asked many questions. I'm just giving short answers to each. All of them are really important questions. You talked about the middle class. I think the middle class as a mass did fail the poor hugely. And I could tell you any number of stories, but it was, people were ringing, like, because we were then distributing food packets, etc. We were getting calls from people in high-rise buildings saying, my maidservant, why don't you give her food? That I'm not going to give her food. They come to us to give them food. But India is still, I don't despair about my country because of those acts of kindness. And there's a whole section of my book where I try to compile a few of these stories. And we have to go away with these stories. There were people, including in Hyderabad, people in different parts, of different, when people were terrified to even touch the bodies, and your own loved ones you were not cremating or burying, they took it upon themselves to give a decent burial, find out if the person was Hindu, Christian, Sikh, and then to give a burial accordingly, taking all the thing about myself. The food, of course, was phenomenal across the country. The oxygen, and I have many stories here. There was a young boy, I always felt very touched, we known something. His father died because he didn't have oxygen. And what does he do? The next morning, after sort of cremating his father, the boy creates an app for people who need oxygen. And between sobbing and mourning his father, he was a class 12 boy. He started trying to find ways, who has oxygen, where you can, and he must have saved a few hundred lives. You had the gurdwaras doing oxygen langars. So India, and I can talk about the poorest also, just it would be incomplete. I work with homeless people, for instance, and I was seeing, so I remember, it was not, I saw this one man, I was saying, how are you managing? So he said, actually, I had saved up a little money. He sleeps on the streets. But he said, it won't last me very long because I couldn't, get food for myself, and look at that family there which is homeless and they have children as well. So whatever money I have, I buy food for myself and I also buy it for them. This is why we still survive as a society. But it's not, I wish it was representative of all of us. It isn't. And lastly, what I would have done differently, I've written this book, you asked me as what? As an activist, as somebody who's concerned, who cares, you know, I'm often called anti-national. I love my country so much. That's why I criticize it. That's why I want it to be better. You know? And so as a concerned citizen, I've written this book. But I do feel a sense of responsibility because I understand how governments work. What would I have done differently? And I've extensively described that. It would take us a lot of time. But, but just a few things, for instance. I mean, immediately, of course, I would set up a public health system for all. I would ensure labor rights. I mean, that would be in the longer one. But even given the situation as it was, I would start with nationalizing the entire health industry as it is. And to start with, we would not have a national lockdown. We'd have small localized. South Korea is interesting. They never had a lockdown. What they did was just testing. Everywhere where you'd go, you'd be, you'd go to the bus station, the metro station. Here, people wore masks. They tested. As soon as you were tested, around you, they would do a tracing. They would lock you down for a short period, etc. There are many examples, and to the extent that you are locking down, provide people wages, provide small and medium enterprises will collapse. There are many countries which actually wrote off the loans and paid paid for a year. And so on. I would have emptied out our prisons rather than adding more people in UAP and what all. I would have emptied out our prisons. There are many things that I've talked about.
Yeah. 20 years ago, there was an interesting slogan that came from the World Socialist Movement, that another world is possible. One thing that has definitely kind of eroded in the last, let's say, 50 years or so, is that people have stopped asking, they've stopped questioning nationalism and the expenditure that the defense sector takes away. In fact, the answer to that question, where will the money come from, really should be that, look at where the money is actually going. And globally, the weapon industry and the military industry is the largest destroyer of the planet and whatever. And given that we have increasing factors of crisis at a planetary scale, the courage to question the expenditure in defense sector all over the world has actually gone down. I mean, even in our left movement, for instance, people don't say anything about defense. It's like sacrosanct. I mean, this is something that has been bothering me for a long, long time. I mean, wherever I get an opportunity, I talk about it. Even in terms of research, biochemical warfare, etc., and we still don't know where the virus really came from. But there are other, earlier biochemical, for instance, AIDS, for instance. There are serious reasons to doubt that it was a HIV virus actually did come from defense projects and etc. So when will we get back that courage? To look at a world where people do actually look at the love across the borders and love, and understand the planetary crisis rather than just look at the nationalist, understanding of, the way we are, looking at our existence now.
That's a beautiful question, and again, I could speak for quite long, but I won't because I see it's already 5 o'clock. One thing happened after the collapse of communism to start with. The collapse of the communist experiment in Soviet Russia and China was interpreted as the defeat of the ideas of justice and equality. It wasn't so. 2 great experiments to do this collapsed, and they collapsed for very good reasons, because you were trying to build the most just and humane society by means that were unjust and inhuman. And Gandhiji would have explained very quickly that this is where you're going to go. So, but we first need to reclaim the ideas of justice and equality, and and say those ideas never were and never will be defeated. We have to just find new ways with new imaginations. So that is one thing I want to say. The second was the rise of what is called right-wing populism, but for the politics of fear and hate, is very interestingly connected with two other things. One is extreme crony capitalism across the world, and it's not by chance. And the other is the crushing of democratic dissent. Any sector, I mean, what has happened over the last 10 years in India, the media has completely collapsed in its dissent. The judiciary is faltering. The university, the liberal arts university, has been decimated. Civil society, they've created such a climate of fear by cancelling licenses, doing this, charging people with all sorts of crimes, that more and more people have just chosen silence through this period. So where will we get the courage? Until we have the courage to speak out. And therefore, I believe that whatever happens, all the work I'm trying to do, all the funds may go, all my licenses may go, I might be charged with the gravest crime. But my first public duty is to keep speaking. And to keep speaking about justice and equality and love. And to be critical, of what I think has gone wrong. And one last thing is about, we're also being taught how do you love your country and how do you love your religion. What we're being taught is you can only prove that you love your country by hating other countries. You can only love your religion by hating other religions. Right? Now, Gandhiji's last fast, 2 weeks before he died, when the country had been 1 million people had killed each other, there was hate, there were refugees, etc. One of the things that the refugees were doing would come in, including my extended family, into Delhi. Now, no Muslim places of worship are allowed, so they put murtis into the Connaught Place Mosque, into the Mehroli Dargah, and so on. And Gandhiji said no true place of worship can be built around disrespect or to another, let alone hatred. That cannot be a true place of worship. And we must give these back with respect. And that was his last fast. I mean, so what he was saying is you can only truly love your own religion by respecting every other religion. And there was that young woman called Amulya, and she went onto a stage, and Owaisi was also with them and everyone, and she said something, India Zindabad, and then she said Pakistan Zindabad, and everybody got panicky, and Owaisi tried to drag her off the stage, and her father disowned her, and they put her into prison for, I think, 41 days, charging her with sedition. And she kept trying to explain, 19-year-old girl, that I love my country, but why should I wish ill to the people of Pakistan? I wish them well. I can oppose their government, I can oppose their army, but I don't oppose their people. And it was a voice of such wisdom and humanism that I love my country doesn't mean I have to hate others. Yeah, so a better world is possible.
I think we will have to end here, given Harsh has somewhere else to go as well. Of course, thank you very much for coming amidst your very busy schedule, but more importantly, at least from me and actually from all of us, thank you very much for keeping on speaking and keeping on writing, because as you have said, we cannot afford to forget, and most of us want to forget, and it's people like you who don't allow us to forget, and I think we are grateful for that. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, by the way, So the book is available outside in a small counter. There's some discount. And there is some tea and coffee, I suppose. Yeah.
And this is a little something from us to Harsh. So let's give a big hand for him.
Thank you so much. Thank you all of you for being here and for being a very, very engaged audience. And if this country is going to be saved, it's by young people. We made a great mess, our generation. We have to sort it out.